Hi everybody, and thanks for joining me today for episode 247 of The Art of Procurement. And I'm joined today by Nancy Nicoll. Nancy is Vice President of Not for Resale, so NFR, and Indirect Strategic Sourcing at Retail Business Services. So Retail Business Services is probably one of the largest companies that you've never heard of. It certainly was for me. But they provide business services for the Ahold Delhaize group of supermarkets, which spans the US and Europe. And in fact, as she shares in the pod, Nancy and her team actually cover over $4 billion of spend annually. Now, Nancy and I sat down at the recent ProcureCon Indirect conference in Florida. We covered a wide range of topics, from reporting to the C-suite, because Nancy reports directly to her business's CEO, to managing procurement through a huge corporate merger. While savings continues to be a high priority in what is a razor-thin margin grocery retail environment, they're not the horizon of procurement's focus. For Nancy and the rest of her team, savings are actually the foundation, so what gets them through the door and establishes credibility so that procurement can go on and deliver value that goes way beyond those initial savings. In this conversation, Nancy covers points such as why her organization made the decision not to actually mandate cooperation with procurement, whether emerging technologies hold the key to the challenge of tail spend. She shares a three-part focus on collaborative stakeholder relationships, team investment, and demonstrating a consistent broad value prop. And finally, balancing procurement's process expertise with stakeholders' subject matter expertise so that we get access to some of those creative service spend categories. Well, I start the pod, like I often do, by asking Nancy if she found procurement, or did procurement find her?
Procurement found me. So I started my career at Lord & Taylor really in operations roles and responsibilities. I ran stores, and I was looking to get back into the corporate environment. I really wanted to get out of the store situation, and there was a role in what we called purchasing at the time, and I took the role in purchasing, and I've really spent the rest of my career in this space.
Right. Did you even think of going into a career in purchasing before you started?
No.
Did you have any idea what it was?
I knew they were the people that I argued with a lot to get supplies. Again, being in the stores, they were sort of my nemesis rather than my friend.
Yeah.
So I was young enough to think that I had this idealist notion that I was going to fix it all. And when I went into procurement or purchasing at the time, it was, the yellow amber computer screens. There was one screen that all the associates in the team had to share. There were, carbonized purchase order forms, and it really wasn't clear to me what we did at the time. So it took some time to really understand the power and the potential of what it could be.
So what's your career journey looked like then as you've kind of climbed the ladder within the procurement function?
So again, I started my career at Lord & Taylor, really coming right out of college, did operations roles, went into the purchasing function at Lord & Taylor, and really enjoyed it and loved it, but really wanted to get out of New York City, which is where that role was based, and took an opportunity at Toys R Us. And this was my first real experience on the direct side, so on the product side of the business, which I found I really didn't like as much. And it was sort of being on the indirect side, you're always pressured to go on the direct side because they always want to take those skills and put them on the direct side of the business.
It's funny, just to jump in. In Europe, it's the opposite. So it's really interesting to me how in Europe, indirect is seen as the place to be, and in the US, it's more, you got to go into a direct role.
It's almost like you're a secondary citizen in a lot of respects. And it was funny because at the time, Toys R Us was Tickle Me Elmo, all this really fun. It was a very successful company at the time, which we all know later did not turn out well. But it was really a lot of fun, and I really liked taking processes and practices that I had done on the indirect side and really deploying them on the direct side. The other interesting thing I did there was really start a vendor partnership initiative, because I think in procurement and purchasing, we focus so much on price and kind of beating vendors down. On the direct side, I really saw the power of if we gave vendors an opportunity to really connect with us and talk to us about what we were doing, to even drive costs and things. There was huge value in that. And then when I took a role at the time at Food Lion, and they were starting indirect sourcing function, I was able to kind of bridge that indirect experience with the direct experience in vendor management and bring it to Food Lion. Yeah,
it's interesting how as well in direct, you always have the mandate. I don't want to say always. Oftentimes you have the mandate. So, procurement's kind of built into the process, where obviously on the indirect side, to me, it's a lot more about the personal skills, the influence, the persuasion, because while the mandate may exist from a policy or a process perspective, the reality is you really got to sell the value prop more in indirect than I think you do on the direct side.
Well, and I think I've struggled with this because I think we've recently gone through a merger, Ahold Delhaize, and Legacy Ahold did have a mandate. Legacy Delhaize did not.
Okay.
So part of the struggle and the determining what the new kind of value proposition was going to be in the new team was, did we want to have a mandate? And I ultimately landed that no, because in my mind, we need to be able to sell our services and work collaboratively with our stakeholders and our business partners. And there is nothing worse than having a hostile business owner on the other side of the table. Yeah. And if we do this work well, it just becomes part of the expectation. There shouldn't have to be a mandate and a sort of a compliance conversation. It should be, let's talk about what we can do for you in a collaborative kind of conversation. And I know sometimes the team gets frustrated by that because in their minds it would make it easier. If we just had a mandate, it would make it easier. And we have established a threshold where we know our sweet spot is spend about $250K and over annually, either aggregated or in an annual purchase. So we do try to give guidance, but I think that mandate it just puts us in a very kind of oppositional conversation with our stakeholders.
Yeah, I completely agree. You know, what we would need to be doing is creating a value prop that makes it compelling enough for people to want to work with us, as opposed to saying that you should work with us. And being in both environments, even in a mandate-based environment, people are going to find ways not to work with you if they don't want to work with you.
Exactly.
I'm interested, like, for the under $250,000. So you said you really the sweet spot is $250 and above, and you know, different companies have a different threshold where they start just depending on the size of the company. For the $250 and below, how do you manage that? You know, is it self-sourcing? Are you giving consulting guidance? Are you letting the business just go and do whatever they want?
So I would say, you know, we're at this procurement conference, and one of the things that we've been talking about a lot with peers is the whole notion of tail spend. And I think of the 250 and below as really tail spend. And I think some of the exciting things that are happening in the procurement space is AI, RPA. I think those are the tools that are going to finally allow us to figure out the secret sauce for tail spend. So a long way of answering your question is to say we don't have a good methodology or practice. Essentially, it's business owner led. So if a business owner has, you know, spend of, let's say, $50,000, they kind of go out and do what they think they should do, obviously within the regulations and the rules of the organization. But I think when you start aggregating that spend, you see it to be much more powerful than I think we recognize it to be. Because I know in our company, we spend, it's about $4 billion in annual expenditures, and we spend about 80% of that or 75% of that with our top 100 suppliers. So obviously that's where we want to spend all of our time and energy, but we're almost doing that at the expense of those kind of mid-tier and then the tail spend vendors.
Yeah, it's an interesting question when you think about tail spend is how is it even important to manage it? It's such like a debate, I guess, in should we be managing it? Is it small enough where we really should be focusing on the things that are more material to the business? Do we need to, there's on one side of the equation you say there's a huge cost opportunity because all this is unmanaged spend. On the other side is that somewhere that we really want to focus on, and are we actually creating a negative impact, a negative effect on the business by controlling that spend that's actually stopping us from being able to touch some of the other spend?
But I do think, you know, spend under control is kind of an interesting conversation, because I think with tail spend it means something different. So when we talk about the top 100 vendors, spend under control means our robust sourcing methodology, our repeatable and sustainable processes. I think when we talk about spend under control for tail, it has to mean something very different. It could mean we offer a service or a portal that they go to that we've negotiated, or a framework. But I think we have to kind of get out of our own way in thinking about tail spend, that we must, you know, follow the same kind of processes and thinking. We shouldn't be doing an RFP for a $5,000 expenditure, because the reality is it costs me the same in time and labor for a $5 million spend as it does for a $5,000. So I've got to be a responsible steward for my organization and make sure I'm deploying my resources correctly.
Yeah, no, it's always an interesting question, because, you know, you have obviously technology firms right now. You talked about AI or RPA and how we're starting to think differently about tail spend on the one side of things, but on the other is, should we even be that concerned about it? And I know that that's the easy answer, is, oh, let's just not worry about it. But like you say, how are you really going to make a difference to the business? Well, if we're just thinking about cost management, then, and that's our only metric, then perhaps there's a case to invest a lot of your time and resources there. But if you're thinking about the value add, then it makes sense to actually look at the other areas of spend, because that's what's going to create competitive advantage for your business.
Exactly. And I do think, you know, there's a leverage piece that's missing. I think with tail spend, we're not maximizing our leverage. And the reality is the tools that you just referenced, I think, are going to finally give us insights into tail. Part of, for me, and I think what you're also describing, is we have no idea what tail is. No. We really don't know what's there. And I think those tools are finally going to allow us to see, is this office supply spend that should be made part of an already negotiated contract? Is it completely rogue spend that we need to address? So I think that insight component of those tools is what I find most interesting, and I think will help to drive kind of how we're going to be framing this going forward. So
I know that you've done a lot of work within retail business services around how you kind of change the paradigm of procurement, from a function that is cost-driven to one that really, it's kind of cliche, but I still use it all the time, as going beyond savings, value beyond savings. How, as a leader, have you thought about, and are you putting into practice kind of that journey where you have a community of stakeholders who only know you as a cost savings, a cost management engine, and kind of changing that perception with them?
So we've had a very unique situation. Retail Business Services is a company of Ahold Delhaize USA, and we were formed as a result of the Ahold Delhaize merger. And in that merger, I was given the opportunity to really build on the best of both NFR, or indirect sourcing organizations, to create a new organization. Yep. And one of the things I really thought hard about was, what was the purpose of this organization? What did we want to be? Because the reality was we were tasked with delivering significant synergy dollars, right? That was a non-negotiable. Yeah. But I also started thinking, that's really the price of admission. So the ability of my team to be able to deliver savings in a consistent, methodical way is, again, just a minimum price of what we should be doing. What you're talking about is, what is our purpose? Yeah. What is our value proposition? And for me, it was really building on three core foundations. The first foundation was collaborative relationships with stakeholders, where they view us as a thought partner, not someone who's just driving for savings. Yeah. The second was the ability to invest in the team. So to make sure the team is curious. We have a diverse skill set. It's not just kind of what I would think of as 10, 15 years ago, just sourcing practitioners, people who are data scientists, people who think differently about the business. Within the NFR organization, we don't have really many true sourcing professionals. We have a diverse population of people who have come from marketing, who have come from business services, from finance, and really leveraging those skills. And the third is being able to demonstrate our total value proposition to the organization consistently. And for me, value is value creation and competitive advantage. Yeah. It's no longer just about saving money. Yeah. Am I creating value, and am I delivering competitive advantage? And the conversation we had before about tail spend, I believe that companies who figure out how to manage tail spend will have competitive advantage over those who do not. So those are the kinds of things that I look for in terms of how I frame the organization. Yeah. So how are you actually kind of positioning the value? Because we obviously talk about savings, measuring savings all the time, it being what we're all measured on. We talk about value, how do we change the hearts and the minds of the business to go there? But still in our metrics, they're still always very hard savings based. I'm just wondering how you're able to kind of change that conversation so that it's not just all about hard savings. I don't think it's changing. I think it's building on it. Okay. So as I said, I think for me, saving money is part of what we do. That's how we got to where we are. So you think about when I first started my career in purchasing, as we talked about before, it was a very back office function with one amber computer screen. I'm really not kidding. The reality is over the last 10, 15 years, we've completely shifted the conversation. I've reported to the CFO of an organization. I now report to the president of RBS because of what we've delivered. So I think it's building on it and talking about those value creation opportunities. So for me, in my conversations with leadership, I obviously talk about savings, but also the other things that we're doing, and there's a lot of interest in that. And there's a lot of momentum that then created in the organization because of those, I'll call them value-added kind of services and deliveries. Yeah. How are you able then to translate that into getting into new areas of spend? There's so many categories that, they're kind of don't like the term, but the low-hanging fruit. It's easier for us to get engaged in certain categories than it is for others. And obviously there's a lot of resistance more in the creative categories, or where you have subject matter experts, like deep subject matter experts embedded in their business. How are you able to kind of engage with those in a way that doesn't feel to the stakeholders we're trying to influence that we're just showing up to save them money? Well, I think it's also the expertise notion. So some of these harder categories are places where our business owners and stakeholders have deep expertise, and the reality is my organization is not. We're experts in our process. We're not experts in the category. So I think it's leading that conversation in a very collaborative way, explaining our role and how we believe we could benefit that stakeholder. But I'd also say one of the most important factors is senior leadership advocacy. The reality is if senior leadership is bought into what we're doing, that creates a demand in the organization. Because again, I operate with that a mandate. So there's an expectation that leaders will use NFR services across the organization and the footprint. But again, I want to make very sure that people don't feel that it's being forced upon them. It would be in a mandate, that we're respecting their knowledge and expertise, but partnering on driving a great outcome.
There's a couple of things I wanted to dive a little bit deeper in. First of all, you talked about, coming to a conversation and adding value. How do you encourage your team to actually show up and add value the first time they meet somebody? Rather than just showing up and saying, hey, I'm procurement, this is kind of what we do. Because that really is the fulcrum of the trust that we want to start building with somebody that we haven't worked with before.
So it's really selling our services, right? Really talking about what it is that we do, how we want to work in partnership. But you're right, you have to demonstrate it. But I think the risk is very often when you use savings as your only metric, then you're only as good as your last sourcing event. So part of that conversation is building that relationship. So it's not just about savings, and they can start really seeing us as a trusted advisor versus just someone who's there to force a sourcing event result upon them to save money.
You talked as well about hiring a diverse skill set. And I think we struggle sometimes with that because we have the notion of hiring people who look like us in terms of experience level, because that's what we know how they think. There's a little bit more risk in bringing somebody in that, for all intents and purposes, we don't necessarily know how they think and how they're going to succeed in a procurement environment. Like, what gives you the comfort to actually go and do that? Helps you kind of, and maybe it's something that comes natural to you, but oftentimes we just bring in a team of procurement folks who just do procurement. And I think that the future of procurement is based upon bringing people in from the outside and kind of teaching them some of the procurement skills. But it's hard to do that.
I think early in my career, again, kind of what you describe is it's much easier to hire people who think and act like you, but the reality is you don't drive great outcomes that way. I've driven the best outcomes with my most diverse teams, and diverse in experience, age, tenure with the organization. I mean, every component you could imagine was how I think of diversity. That's how we've driven the best outcomes, because people think differently and they bring different parts of a conversation into a sourcing activity. So they force us to look at things differently, and I think then we better represent our stakeholder population.
Now, do you explicitly look for that for every role that you hire, or is there certain roles within your organization where you think, it's actually going to be more value if I look outside of the traditional procurement skill set, but just in that specific role because of whatever conditions may exist in that role?
Every role.
I've seen, it's interesting when you think about building business partnerships, how bringing folks from within that business into procurement helps them kind of strip away the procurement jargon for the people that they work with. And so they're able to start creating those connections where somebody who has had a career in procurement, now there are certain skill sets who can do that, but not everybody who's just got a pure procurement background. And I've just got a pure procurement background, but not everybody is able to do that and make that connection.
But I also think, too, it's bringing people inside NFR, but also back out. So we have people... Exactly. So we have, again, especially post-merger, we've had folks that were previously part of NFR who have gone into business functions. So let's pick marketing as an example. That person now acts as an advocate for NFR within the marketing function. As you said, kind of strips down our language, because we do have a tendency to talk in acronyms and kind of sourcing ease. They're able to not only advocate for our practices, but also for what we do and who we are.
And one of the other things I just wanted to touch on was you talked about, obviously, the advocacy from an executive level. How do you think about exec governance and having the executives we're wanting to be our advocates be a part, essentially, of driving the agenda for procurement? Is that something that you do in a formal way, or is it more informally in terms of just, keeping lines of communication open with them?
So in the merger work, senior leadership was actively involved in what we did, both road mapping, the processes we use, kind of the momentum of the work. But now we're in a more business as usual state where it's much more informal, but there's still a lot of interest at the senior leadership level in what we do and how we do it.
Because that's so important, because they are helping you basically drive the journey that you're taking your procurement group on, as opposed to just doing everything in isolation. You mentioned the fact that you report directly to the president. How as a procurement leader, one of the things we always aspire to, but how is it in practice?
It's interesting because about 4 years ago, prior to the merger, I started reporting directly to the CFO of Deleuze US.
Yeah.
And at the time, it was a real paradigm shift for me because the reality was I had to report information differently. I had to translate the activities of the team differently. So now coming out of the merger and reporting to the president of RBS, it's similar for me. It does give you a different seat at the table in terms of the organization. So knowing my reporting structure, I'm able to kind of, I would say, accelerate work. I don't have to go through so many layers, but I also have to use that responsibility, use it responsibly.
Yeah.
I can't use it as a machete in the organization, and I try to walk that line so that I'm building relationships as opposed to tearing them down because of my reporting structure.
What are the kind of conversations that resonate at that executive level? You said about walking a fine line. I'm imagining it's not necessarily about going and saying, hey, business unit Y is making a decision I don't agree with, but you're more looking at directional strategy. Is that what you find the discussion is at that level? Or is it still responsive and kind of operational?
I think it really depends upon the category or the event. I think we've done a lot of work in credit and debit card fees as an example. So those conversations with leadership are very rich and detailed. Other categories, we talk more about our results. So I think it's the potential impact of the work that kind of helps to drive kind of the degree to which whether or not it's going to be operational or more aspirational.
And as you kind of continue on your journey to create additional value over the cost savings, innovation is a big piece of that. I'm interested what innovation, because we all I think in procurement talk about innovation without necessarily knowing what it means. I'm interested, what does that mean in the context of your role and your team at RBS?
So innovation is something, particularly in my industry, we use a lot. That's kind of the latest buzzword, right?
Yeah.
So we talk about frictionless technology for our customers. We talk about robots in our stores. But for me, innovation within kind of the four walls of a sourcing organization means we have to think about our work differently. We can't continue to RFP and expect to deliver great results. We have to think about how do we deliver real value to the organization, either through value creation, through collaborative and credible relationships with our stakeholders, and how do we partner with our suppliers differently? I think we've all kind of talked about the notion of supplier relationship management and what does it mean, but I really believe that in order to drive the kind of value we're going to need to as an industry, we have to partner and innovate with our suppliers, have much more collaborative, open conversations about ways that we can mutually derive benefit.
And as you think about that kind of supplier segmentation model, typically we think about suppliers and their importance based on the spend. And obviously that isn't necessarily a good way to think about it when you're thinking about innovation, because you miss so much innovation from some of the emerging and some of the smaller companies. How do you think about where to actually focus that supplier relationship management efforts to help drive innovation? Is it product-based, opportunity-based? I'd just love to kind of hear how you kind of connect that with innovation that's out there in supply markets.
So I'm going to not hedge the answer, but it's really all of the above. So I think the first filter for me is spend. So you obviously want to go after your larger suppliers first, but some of them aren't going to be able to deliver that kind of innovation. So I think you've got to kind of tick down by both category, the space that they're in. So some categories are very rich in suppliers, some are not. So in some situations where you may have even single supplier situations, that may be the best opportunity to really innovate with a supplier differently. So it's somewhat situational, and I think it's really kind of a combination of all of the above.
Yeah, well, I think that's important though. Is actually there isn't one way to do it, because we sometimes try and push a single way of doing it, and it's being a little bit more open to be flexible.
But I think, too, as practitioners, we're very good in our process, right? We like processes, and I've often joked that I like checklists. I'm very fond of a checklist. And I think when we talk about the word innovation, we have to kind of get out of our own way as practitioners. We have to recognize that we've been successful, our processes are rich, we all have either 6-step, 7-step, 5-step kind of methodologies, but when we talk about innovation, how are we going to continue to kind of build on the foundations of success we've had, but actually continue to deliver savings and value to our organizations?
Yeah, I feel like the processes, I don't think they'll ever go away, and the frameworks will never go away, but it's building, having them as being more advisory, or it's a framework, it's not a 7 steps, that actually gives some leeway to the people who are actually in the categories. So you're not telling them, well, this is how you innovate, and these are the 10 ways you go about innovating. It's within the boundaries of this framework, actually be creative.
Well, we've actually used the expression, or I've used it, our toolbox. So our 6-step methodology, the different kinds of tools and processes we use are kind of part of this big toolbox. And I expect the team, the category leads, to be able to pull the right tool out of the toolbox and to experiment. And that's the way I think you innovate, because I think they've got to determine which parts of the 6-step they can actually pull from to be successful. And in some situations, they may not pull any part of the 6-step. But I think it's giving them the license to be creative and really try to say what's the outcome they're trying to deliver, and then pull the right tool.
Right. So I think this is important. How about how are we creating, or how are you creating a safe space that actually gives your team the confidence to go and do that, to experiment, to be creative, as opposed to just following a rigid process?
So it's actually a really good question. I think this was a learning for me coming out of the merger. So I came from the Legacy Delays organization, where I think we were more rigid and focused that this is our process. We were a very lean team. That's the way we kind of drove success. And I think coming together as this new NFR organization, we really celebrate our successes. We really take the time to say, what's going on in people's personal lives? How do we actually inspire each other? How do we celebrate, if you're, let's say, in a marketing team and there was a great success in the corp services team, we want you to know about it and celebrate it. We also bring the team together. So we're geographically diverse in that we sit at 5 of our different corporate campuses. And the reality is bringing us together to form connections, build relationships, also helps them to also say, well, how did you do this? And let me try that, and actually start kind of knowledge sharing.
Yeah. Now, with your stakeholders, is that something you do with your stakeholders too? So encouraging your teams to actually co-locate, so that you're actually building a more, it's creating relationships that are not procurement versus your stakeholder.
Correct.
We talked earlier a little bit about, showing up and adding value in the first conversation. And, an easy way to do that is obviously having an expert in every category. And for all the best will in the world, whether a 2-person procurement organization or a 400-person procurement organization and everything in between, it's just not possible to be an expert in everything. How are you thinking about, having somebody who isn't necessarily an expert in a category? How are they positioning themselves as somebody who can actually help their business, and so that the business doesn't just look at them as being, hey, it's a generalist who's going to help me run a process, because we want to be doing more than that for our stakeholders, obviously.
And I think it's about, and I do struggle with the word expert, because I think for me, expertise can mean a couple different things. I think we always have to respect our stakeholder and business owner as the expert in the category in their particular area of spend. We're there to be experts in our process and what we can help partner with them to deliver. But I do think an opportunity, and something that I've seen kind of evolving in this work, some of these new technologies with AI, data analysis, data scientists, I think for me that's an area of growth for my team, ensuring that we actually bring data and enrichment and insights into the conversations with the stakeholders. So utilizing new tools and new ways of kind of leading conversations with stakeholders to drive different kinds of conversations, not just about competing for who's more expert in a particular category.
Showing with data. And data that actually...
but it's meaningful, it's insightful.
So often we turn up with data that is either wrong or doesn't really mean anything, but it's the only data we have access to.
Our current spend visibility tool, we kind of cross our fingers because it's at best about 80% correct. It's directional, very important, but we'd really like it to be not only accurate, completely accurate, but also insightful, and also give us the ability to look at that data differently and be able to drive different decisions.
So I want to wrap up just by asking about your journey. So you started with the journey through a merger, and been able to create the organization. You saved significant amounts of money, but obviously you're doing it in a way to make the function sustainable. So it's not just showing up and saving money at all costs and having a really big impact, but then 2 or 3 years later you're kind of looking around saying, okay, what's next for us? You're thinking about that now, so that you don't get to that point. So as the journey evolves, what does it look like? From where are you going? What does the next 2 or 3 years look like?
So I think it's staying true to our core values and purpose, as I said originally, ensuring that we're very, very clear on what it is we deliver to the organization, but also kind of getting comfortable in being uncomfortable. So doing things, I think as a traditional sourcing operation, we love apples to apples analysis. That's kind of our bread and butter. That's what's made us successful. I think it's stretching ourselves to get really comfortable in the fact that we're going to be in categories that we've never touched before, that don't feel as familiar, as well as analysis that may not be apples to apples, and still be able to be confident that we can drive great outcomes in those pieces of work, but also not losing sight of how important that collaborative relationship is with the stakeholder. So continue to build that relationship so we're a trusted advisor, not someone that's, again, forcing a savings decision upon them.
Do you see that your metrics ultimately aligning directly with those of the stakeholders? so that you can help, you're connecting to their impact as opposed to just looking at your impact in isolation of everybody else.
They have to. So we have to be very clear on what's important to the stakeholder and really deliver or develop our ability to have I call almost a business acumen to be able to say what's important to our stakeholder and how can we ensure that we're part of that success metric as opposed to our particular KPIs. Our KPIs are important, but if they're not in support of what the business owner says is important, then ultimately we will not be successful.
Well, Nancy, I want to thank you so much for sharing your journey with us and with listeners on the Art of Procurement. The easy question that I always ask at the end is, if listeners would like to connect with you, ask you questions, just follow up, where would be the best place for them to find you?
Through LinkedIn. My LinkedIn profile is Nancy Nicoll at LinkedIn.
Okay, great. I will put the link to your LinkedIn profile, it's a mouthful, on our show notes. That's going to be artofprocurement.com/podcast. Nancy, thank you very much for joining me.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Thank you. Hi there. I want to thank you for tuning in to today's podcast. You can check out all of our back catalogue at artofprocurement.com/podcast, where you can also subscribe to our newsletter to make sure that you never miss an episode. And if you found value in today's show, I'd love if you would tell a peer, or perhaps go and rate and review by going to artofprocurement.com/review. Word of mouth really is the best way to help the podcast grow, and if you're able to do either one of those things, I would truly appreciate it.